Good morning. Today's scripture is from the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 through 22, and I am reading from the New International Version. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to go home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you from me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. The word of the Lord.
Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lydia Cruttwell. I spent almost 10 years as pastor of what was originally known as First United Mennonite Church, is now known as Peace Church on 52nd in Vancouver. and I'm now taking a break from ministry. I'm actually working at the organization that trains dogs like Gucci, Pacific Assistance Dog Society, and not as a dog trainer, as a kind of administrator behind the scenes. And my home church is Chinatown Peace Church down on the downtown east side. So I bring you their greetings. I was actually preaching there last week on Jonah, so I guess I'm into the Old Testament this summer, and I'll be here this week and next to talk about the book of Ruth. And today, that means starting with the first 5 verses of Ruth, which are a bit of a gut punch, a veritable avalanche of loss, grief, and emptiness. In a mere 5 verses, Naomi experiences famine so severe that she has to leave her homeland, her husband dies, and then after 10 years without producing any heirs, both of her sons die. Her pain and grief must have been immeasurable. And I recognize for some of you, these 5 verses of loss may hit particularly close to home right now. Not quite 2 weeks ago, you had the memorial service for Vic, a founder and pioneering member of this church and a much beloved brother in Christ. And I know many of you carry personal losses as well. Family members and loved ones who have died or whose end is drawing near, health challenges, economic difficulties, and the pain of living in a climate crisis where there's a never-ending cycle of drought, fires, and floods. While we may not be facing tragedy on quite the scale that Naomi did, we all know her anger and her pain and her loss. We have all had lives that have been touched by loss. There is a great and vast emptiness at the beginning of this book. The emptiness of famine, the emptiness of mourning, the emptiness of grief. Furthermore, Naomi is a woman who has lost all of the things that would have kept her safe in that society, in that age. She is now a woman under triple threat. She is a widow in a foreign land with no family to rely upon. And right along this emptiness in life comes a seeming emptiness in terms of faith as well. This is, after all, the time of the Judges, when Israel is spiraling further and further away from their God with every generation. And Naomi's family, at first glance, seems to be echoing the faithlessness of Israel. When faced with a famine, Elimelech and Naomi and their sons left the promised land and went into a foreign country with foreign gods. Not exactly the mark of people willing to trust in God's provision. And after the death of their father Elimelech, Mahlon and Chilion marry Moabite women. Again, not very advisable in that age when intermarriage often meant, at the best, the mixing of religious systems, and at worst, outright idolatry and turning away from the God of Israel. For some of us, tragedy and grief drive us deeper into our faith, deeper into leaning on God. But the opposite reaction is also very common and very understandable. Moving away from faith, away from God. How could you do this, Lord? Where are you, God, in the midst of all this loss and pain? Now, before I move farther into the story itself, I want to pause for a moment and note something really important. The very fact that this story exists, that it's part of our Bible at all. Ancient literature written in the time that the book of Ruth was written generally focused on kings and emperors, not on unimportant widows like Naomi and Ruth. Ancient literature generally focused on great triumphs and military victories, not on loss and grief and pain. And so the very fact that the book of Ruth is part of our holy scriptures reminds us 2 things. It reminds us that our God, Yahweh, cares about ordinary people and ordinary things, like the loss of a husband. And he cares about our pain, our grief, and our loss. As hard as it may be, grieving our losses is not an exception or a distraction from the life of faith, but a natural and important part of it. God does not blame or rebuke Naomi for her very understandable grief, not even when she rails against God for turning his hand against her. It is within the context of this pain, this grieving, this bitterness, that God's redemption and God's new life is found. If you are deep in the valley of grief or pain right now, friends, then please remember that you are not alone. Our scriptures, not only these first 5 verses of Ruth, but also the lament psalms, the Israelites in exile, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, bear witness to the fact that the Lord understands and supports people who are in deep grief and who are expressing that through bitterness and anger. God is with you and God is for you, even when it feels as if darkness is your only friend, as Psalm 88 ends. But the story does not end with these first 5 verses. Even though it seems like the end for Naomi, it is in fact but a new beginning. And as with so much of our lives, the first glimmer of hope comes not from human action, but instead from the gracious action of God. A gracious action of God that brings hope and new life into a situation that seemed utterly hopeless. In verse 6, we read, Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. There's a pun embedded in this whole book of Ruth, a play on words that is too delicious to ignore. It's not just that Yahweh has brought food to his people. The Hebrew word here is lechem, which means bread. Like the manna in the desert, God has once more given bread to his people. And we have already been told that Naomi is originally from Bethlehem, Beit Lechem. It literally means the house of bread. Into this situation of extreme emptiness, this is our first hint of a filling up. The house of bread is being restocked by the God of Israel, and so Naomi decides to return home. Yahweh has come to the aid of his people, and Naomi recalls once again that she is one of Yahweh's people, and so she decides to return to Beit Lechem, the house of bread, and to cast herself on the mercy of God. Return. That is our key word for this passage, and it is repeated again and again. It's repeated so often in the Hebrew that actually our English translations often translate it with several different words. Go back, go home, return, and so on. Naomi's choice is clear. She must go back to the only place left where she has family by blood. And the news of God's grace is a further incentive to go. But for Orpah and Ruth, the choice is more difficult. Do they stay with their mother-in-law and return with her to a land they have never known? Or do they leave their mother-in-law and return instead to their own family homes? Again, they are widows. They are without the protection of husband or sons in a time when that was a very dangerous thing. And so it is that Naomi's first speech in this book is to say to her daughters-in-law in verse 8, return. Return home to your mother's house. And then she speaks a blessing over these 2 women, invoking the name of her God, Yahweh, and that best of all Hebrew words, Hesed. May Yahweh show you steadfast love, Hesed, kindness, as you have shown Hesed to your dead and to me. May Yahweh grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. In the midst of her own grief and pain, Naomi's first words are to ask her God to grant her daughters-in-law the very things that have been taken from her, a husband and a secure home. And then she gives them a goodbye kiss and weeps at this parting. This speaks to Naomi's essential good character, to her own loving kindness, to her basic faith in the God of Israel, and to her care for these women who have become like daughters to her. And Ruth and Orpah respond with one voice, we will return with you to your people. They do not want to lose the last member of their immediate family, and they choose loyalty to Naomi over loyalty to their own mothers, their own families. They defy Naomi, and in doing so, show that they love her. And Naomi reacts quite strongly to this show of loyalty and love, but she reacts in a strongly negative way. It's here that Naomi's pain and bitterness and anger at the whole situation comes bursting out of her, and she gives her longest speech in the whole book, starting in verse 11. Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Where Naomi's first speech shows us her goodness and her faith, this speech shows us her pain, her anger, her doubts. She is a woman who does believe in Yahweh and even believes that her God can bless others. But through her many painful experiences, she's come to believe that God is not going to bless her. Naomi is a woman who believes deep down that God has it in for her, that Yahweh is not for her, but against her. It's a hard speech to read. It's full of sarcasm and bitterness and a touch more graphic detail than we would like. Naomi even gets a little bit crude when she says, even if she had a husband tonight and produced other sons, it would still be too late for Ruth and Orpah to marry them. Naomi cannot see any way that she and her daughters can get themselves out of the situation. And so she is convinced that God has turned against her and that the best thing she can do for her daughters-in-law is to send them far, far away from her and the Lord's judgment against her. For Orpah, this speech is convincing. She kisses her mother-in-law once again, and she leaves. And she weeps, and she follows her mother-in-law's command. Orpah is returning to her people and to her gods. It's a return, not only a familiar return, but a religious one as well. She's returning to the Moabite deities. Orpah is obedient one last time to her mother-in-law. And so she disappears from the story, choosing the return that takes her back to her own mother's house. But Ruth does not. Ruth defies convention and disobeys her mother-in-law. And more than that, Ruth clings to Naomi. The use of the word clings or cleaves here is startling. It's a word more usually used when we're talking about marriage. It's the same word used in that famous passage of Genesis 2. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And Ruth goes on to back up her actions with words, with a vow, a formal pledge of commitment, complete with the traditional ancient Near Eastern form of calling down punishment from God if the vow is broken. These are, very justly, the most famous words in the entire book of Ruth, in verses 16 and 17. Don't urge me to leave you or to return from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May Yahweh deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. As we've already seen, Naomi's first words are those of care for her daughters-in-law and a prayer to Yahweh, expressions of kindness and faith that even her later bitterness cannot totally wipe away. And as for Ruth, this speech, her first words as an individual, not just jointly with Orpah, Ruth's words are those of radical commitment and faithfulness, self-sacrifice, and a willingness to challenge normal social conventions. These traits very much define Ruth throughout the book. A quick aside here, I find it funny that these words are often used at marriage ceremonies. They are beautiful words of commitment, and they're poetic, and they're lovely, and the word cling or cleave already gets most of us thinking in terms of marriage. But these aren't words spoken from a wife to a husband or a husband to a wife. They're spoken from a daughter-in-law to a mother-in-law. They represent a covenant, a lasting relationship formed not out of erotic desire or economic benefit, but simply out of love and faithfulness. And Ruth does refer to the God of Israel here, but we don't know how much she knows about Yahweh. If Naomi has been her only religious teacher these last 10 years, She may think of him as more harsh and punishing rather than gracious and loving. This isn't necessarily a conversion narrative, even though she does call on the name of the God of Israel. But it is one important step on Ruth's journey of faith. And it is important to note that she fully understands the high cost of her decision to follow Naomi. It means she's not just leaving behind the land of Moab and the people of Moab, but the gods of Moab as well. This decision of loyalty to Naomi involves leaving behind every last shred of security Ruth had as a Moabite woman. It means that she is becoming the widow in a foreign land with no men to protect her. Despite all Naomi's anger, despite the risks involved, despite even what Naomi said about God being against her, Ruth throws her lot in with her mother-in-law. She ties her own future to a woman who, by her own admission, has no future. It's pretty stunning. And certainly Naomi is stunned. Ruth's speech stops the conversation entirely. Naomi has nothing to say and gives up trying to convince Ruth to leave. Instead, the two begin the long journey to Bethlehem, a journey the narrator describes in a simple sentence in verse 19. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. One imagines a fairly silent journey as each of these women struggles with a torrent of emotions, mourning and sadness and anger, apprehension at what the future might bring, and perhaps just the merest flicker of hope, of faith. We can tell Naomi's journey was filled with emotion, since at the first possible moment she bursts forth again in anger and bitterness, when the women of the town immediately start gossiping and say, "Oh, can this be Naomi?" This is where Naomi proclaims, she makes another kind of pun in Hebrew. The word Naomi means pleasant in Hebrew. And she says she's going to change her name instead to Mara, which means bitter. And her language in this speech is even more explicit. It draws on the fullness and emptiness imagery I used before and directly blames God for her troubles. I went away full, but the Lord brought me back empty. Why call me pleasant? Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought evil upon me. In these words, she's focusing solely on herself as the victim. She doesn't admit that part of the problem may have been the initial decision to move away to Moab. And she doesn't mention that she's not coming back empty. She's coming back with a steadfast daughter-in-law, Ruth, who is standing right alongside her. In this moment, I have great compassion for Naomi. We all know it's not easy to be around someone who is this bitter and angry, this focused on themselves as the sole victim of pain. But imagine for a moment what this homecoming must have been like for Naomi. Rather than returning in triumph with a husband and sons and a whole passel of grandchildren in tow, she returns widowed and destitute, with only a single foreign woman accompanying her. She cannot even keep her grief and her pain private. Instead, she's immediately subject to questions and to gossip from the women of Bethlehem upon her return. She is empty. And she feels like everyone can see just how empty she is. And yet the last word of this chapter belongs not to Naomi or to Ruth or to the women of Bethlehem, but to the narrator. And it is the narrator who quietly reminds us that amongst this emptiness, there are 2 points of hope: Ruth's faithfulness and the end of the famine. Verse 22 reads, "So Naomi returned from Moab, returning with Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem just as the barley harvest was beginning." Naomi does not return entirely empty, even if she can't see it yet. Ruth chose to return with her, becoming a foreigner herself in order to join with Naomi, to join with Naomi's people and with Naomi's God. And Naomi does not return to an empty Bethlehem, an empty house of bread. Thanks to the provision of God, the sheaves of barley stand tall and full in the fields. In the face of bitterness, loss, and mourning, there is hope. Small and fragile, and not what was expected, but hope nonetheless. So that's the story as we read it thus far. What do we make of it? What do we do with it? I want to be a bit wary of drawing easy conclusions here, of making principles or laws or morals out of this story, precisely because it is a story. The Old Testament narratives that we find in Joshua and Judges and Ruth, as well as in Samuel and Kings and even Chronicles, they're often not meant to illustrate principles for all time, but simply to show the progress of God's history of redemption. Ruth and Naomi and Orpah and Boaz, when we meet him next week, they're not cardboard cutouts of perfect, godly people. They're not cardboard cutouts of villains. They're real people. They're people who grieve and yell and laugh and cry, people who are struggling to figure out what it means to live well and to live faithfully. And God chooses to work with them, as he chooses to work with us in the midst of their story, drawing them into his long-term redemptive work, to the slowly unfolding kingdom of peace and grace and justice. So rather than a Naomi did this and so should you, or Naomi didn't do this and did do this and you shouldn't, rather I just want to point to a few things I see in this story. I see that Naomi is a faithful woman whose experiences over the last 15 years or so have caused her to doubt God's goodness. She can still speak the Lord's blessing over others, but deep down she believes that God hates her. Sometimes the painful circumstances of life, whether they're caused by God, by our own mistakes, by the sins of others, or simply by the brokenness of the world, can cause faithful people to get lost in their grief and move toward despair and hopelessness. And when that happens, those people, even if they are us, deserve our compassion, not our judgment. When a brother or sister is caught in the whirlpool of grief and cannot hold on to hope for themselves, we can hold on to hope for them, remembering that God's steadfast love is stronger even than the grave. I see that while we think of covenant language as either applying to marriage partners or perhaps to us and God, here we find a covenant between two women connected only by tragedy and pain. Ruth's covenant with Naomi is a covenant of pure chesed, pure steadfast love. Ruth stays with her mother-in-law not for any economic or familial gain, but because she loves her. And in making that commitment, I see Ruth making a leap of faith, a choice to commit, even though she doesn't know what the future may bring. And I see that God's story of redemption sometimes begins with the smallest of steps, with a destitute widow coming back to her hometown, with a scared refugee arriving in a new place, with the barley harvest about to begin. I see in this story of return a reminder that we can always return to God, even if we come weeping or fearful or angry. I see in this story a reminder that even when we doubt God's goodness, this does in no way affect the fact that he is still good, and that God still works to redeem all our little stories by bringing them into his big story. I'd like to end my sermon today with a prayer adapted from Methodist minister Kristen Hayden. Let us pray. Gracious God, for the times when we have doubted your goodness and gone far away, forgive us and help us see your love once more. For the moments when pain and bitterness have caused explosions of anger, forgive us and draw us into your arms of compassion. For the moments when we have increased another's pain by our gossip or our lack of empathy, Forgive us and help us see them through your eyes of grace. Empower us by your Spirit to return to you, as Naomi and Ruth return to your house of bread. Open our hearts that we may accept your love and mercy and proclaim that same love and mercy in word and deed. Open our eyes that we may see the blessings of the harvest, of bread, and of faithful companions for the journey. Open our hands that we may serve the people, all people, in your name and with grace, and with your grace. As Ruth loved Naomi, as Naomi loved Ruth, help us to love our neighbors, acknowledging the covenant relationship we share as children of God. May we be an example of your loving kindness, steadfast love, and endless mercy. Amen.